Hello my fellow kin, welcome back to the channel and welcome to another competitive list review. On today's agenda, we'll be taking a look at the Firebug Open held in Ettlingen, Germany on the weekend of March 22nd to the 24th, 2024. As always, we'll take a look at the Votann placing, look at the scores, do a deep dive into list analysis, discuss some strengths and weaknesses, and of course contextualize the results of the placing by examining the matchups. The list in today's video was piloted by Max Press Counter, who came second out of 156 players, taking home a 6-win, 0-draw, 0-loss streak. Matchups included Game 1 of Votann of 100 versus Votann at 61 for the mirror matchup. Game 2 was Votann at 87 versus Eldari at 63. Game 3 was Votann at 52 versus Deathguard at 44, a very low-scoring game for both players. Game 5 is Votann 95 versus Thousand Suns at 26 for a devastating victory. Game 5 was Votann at 98 versus Custodes at 97, making for a very close game. And then wrapping the event up, we have Game 6 of Votann 82 versus Custodes at 69. Nice. Before we take a look at the list, I want to give a quick shout out to our community Discord, which you can join free of charge by using the link in the description below. Come join a community of like-minded kin where we discuss tactics, competitive lists, and hobby posts as well. You may even get your pictures posted in my weekly videos like we see here with Crested Dwarf Lord's beautifully painted Rusted Pioneer squad, which is very thematically appropriate for today's video. With that said, let's jump on into the list. You may immediately notice the 6 stack of Sagittars you see in the middle of your screen right now, each equipped with highlights. And I want you to keep this in mind as we discuss the content of the list, because this is going to be relevant to contextualizing why certain choices were made. Kicking things off, we have the inclusion of 2 Grimnirs coming in at 65 points each, bare bones, no enhancements taken on these guys. We also have a third and final character in the list being a Cal, who's running the enhancement of Appraising Glare. For those of you who don't know what Appraising Glare does, it allows you to essentially pick an objective marker on the board, and anything standing on that objective marker counts as having 1 extra judgment token on it. Now this, in combination with the Cal's native ability to apply a judgment token to something it has visibility on, makes for a very strong synergy. What this means is that at certain points in the game, you can instantly drop 2 judgment tokens on a target, which amplifies the damage of the rest of the units in your list. As such, this is an excellent force multiplier for your army, especially when we're running something that is hyper aggressive and hyper fast, like we see with this list here. Now the Cal is going to be accompanying a squad of 10-man Ironeer Hearthguard, and the Hearthguard have a pretty interesting loadout. So we start off with the standard Hesir with the Concussion Hammer and the Teleport Crest. Nothing too crazy here, but what is interesting is that this 10-man brick is equipped with Vulcanites. Now you may be wondering, well, why Vulcanites? Isn't the Plasma Gun better on a 10-man brick? Well, if you watch my Ironeer Hearthguard video, you would know that it actually doesn't make that much of a difference when you include lethal hits, because the lethal hits, while taking away from some of the devastating wounds, actually allow you to have a little bit more play into higher toughness targets. In fact, you wind up with around 1 to 2 extra damage on average, which is fairly comparable to what we get when we compare that to the plasma guns. Now, personally, I prefer the inclusion of an E-Champ. I think that the champion provides you with some value through its native reroll charges, because I think when you come out of Deep Strike, having the ability to get yourself into a better position and not just be potentially out in the open is always going to be strong. But I understand why the Cal was taken within the context of this list, because what we value here more is the damage amplification that the rest of the army will benefit from. It's also worth considering that maybe we simply don't need plasma guns. We have 6 Sagittars, each running Hylas. That means we are bringing a ton of anti-tank and high elite shooting. We don't necessarily need to rely on the 10 shots you'd get with the Ironeer Hearthguard. In fact, we'd probably want to prioritize shooting capabilities that would complement that of the Sagittar. So while the Sagittar are dealing with anything that is high toughness like a tank, we have the Ironeer Hearthguard who are going to be able to reliably pick up with the Vulcanites anything else. And lastly, it's also worth mentioning again that the Vulcanites aren't really bad. They allow you to have play because of devastating wounds and the mass amount of shots you get out of them to actually have better play into things that might be slightly tougher as well. Circling back to the beginning of the list, we could see a 10-man inclusion of Hearthkin Warriors. Now, it doesn't matter too much what these guys are equipped with. They don't really do any damage, but there is one weapon choice that is important, and that is the high-las auto rifle. This is key for the unit. What this allows you to do is essentially advance and still be eligible to shoot, which means you can do an action. Why is that important? Because these guys are slow. They have movement speed 5, and if you have the ability to complement that by advancing and still being able to do an action, now we're in business. Now this unit has greater range, it is able to disembark, it's able to get a little bit more movement, and it can actually still perform the action if it needs to advance just to get within range of a table quarter or an objective or the center of the table. So I really think it's essential, and it's a powerful inclusion that you can take to your Hearthkin Warriors just to get more value out of the unit. Now I want to quickly jump back into the Sagittars. I said there were 6 Sagittars in this list, and they're all equipped with high-las. Typically, this is what we'll see if there's a lot of vehicles taking high-las, because we get to bake in some of that variability by having so many shots going out. Eventually, the damage will average out because we're shooting so much. But I'm actually starting to lean on the fence that it doesn't matter how many Sagittars you take. I actually think the high-las is just better overall. I have a unit analysis video you can check out on the Sagittar, which came out last week, and I talk about this in a little bit more detail where you can actually see some of the numbers we get. But the ceiling for a single Sagittar is 48 damage. I know it's improbable, you probably will never see this happen, but just the fact that 48 damage can come out of this little dune buggy at 115 points versus a total ceiling of 6 damage if you're running the missile launcher is just a little disappointing. I think it's basically always worth running the high-las just because you could spike and it gives you so many more options. Again, especially if you're running 6. Now there is a drawback for bringing so many Sagittars, or any Sagittars for that matter, and that is the dedicated transport tax. You gotta pay your dedicated transport tax. And what is that? Well, that is anything that's going inside. So because of that, we typically, if we're bringing a lot of Sagittars, want to keep our costs low. They got a slight point increase, we need to compensate for that. We want to bring 6 still, so we got to cut points from somewhere else. This is why you'll often see the inclusion of a tech piece like the Grimnir, because he's only 65 points, he's significantly cheaper than a warrior squad, and it still allows you to fill that Sagittar up and have a unit that you can throw away onto an objective. It's relatively tough because it has an invulnerable save, and it allows you to just pay your tax while being able to perform secondaries with the cargo regardless. So it's a win-win, and this is why you often see Grimnirs taken. Now, typically a Grimnir will also have the enhancement Wayfarer's Grace where it gets up on a 2+, just giving it a little bit more survivability and utility. But in this case here, the pilot doesn't care. He's taking these Grimnirs to pay the tax. He's running 6 Sagittars. He's not bringing Sagittars to transport the things inside. He's bringing the things inside to bring the Sagittars. And because of that, he's keeping the cost as low as possible to bring as many as he can. So because of that, we're starting the game off with 2 Grimnirs inside of 2 Sagittars, and then we're splitting our warriors into the other 2 Sagittars that we see in the middle. So what about the final 2 Sagittars? Well, these are going to be carrying Chthonian Berserks, and these guys are going to be equipped with 5 Mauls each. I have another unit analysis video on my channel where you can take a look at the math behind the decision making here, but the Mauls always come out on top overall, and I think that they're just the better choice hands down. It allows you to have significantly more play because you do a ton of damage at damage 3 profiles, which is huge for the army. At only 100 points, these guys have the ability to potentially kill half of a knight's total health pool, which is nuts to think about. Now, typically, you'll always see just 1 Berserk squad included as a little token trading piece. Keep your opponent honest. If they try to be too aggressive, you deploy your Berserks and you pick up the squad, whatever they threw at you. In this case, we're running 2, and I think the reason for that is very intentional. Because we're only running 1 Ironeer Hearthguard brick, we can only really commit our hammer unit to 1 area of the table. And because of that, we're lacking some skirmishing units to be able to trade and fight and cause mayhem somewhere else. So I think that's the role that the Berserks are actually playing in this list, at least one of them anyway. Rather than being a designated trading piece, I think it's going to be used more as a skirmishing unit to intentionally try to pick out a fight with something and be annoying. This is what you might expect to see with a second smaller 5-man squad of Hearthguard, which drops in somewhere else, whether it's accompanied by a leader or not. Now within the transport, I actually think the Berserks excel. It allows you to have 2 different plays. You can protect your Sagittar with the Berserks, or you can use your Sagittar to stage the Berserks to be aggressive. So we have a really solid anti-tank shooting platform as we see with these 6 Sagittars with Hylas. But what about things that the Sagittars probably aren't that great into shooting? Well, that's where the 15 Pioneers come in. These guys put out a ton of volume of shots, especially a 6-man squad. Imagine how much damage you can do if you have a 6-man squad and you pop sustained hits 2 on the unit. I don't have a unit analysis on this yet, but I can't wait to figure that out because I think it's going to be astronomical. You will reliably be able to pick up any infantry unit in the game by shooting at it, characters included. What this means is you now have a unit that is super fast with a scout move, it is very aggressive, and it puts out a ton of fire. And more importantly, into things that you don't want your Sagittars to waste their shots on. So you have a very complementary system baked into your list where the 6-man Sagittar brick is shooting anything that's a tank, and then your 6-mans for Pioneers are going to be going around the board, scoping out any units that are trying to be hidden behind ruins, getting some angles, and picking them up. I think the inclusion of a 3-man Pioneer squad is also intentional, and I forgot to mention this before, but everything is running the standard loadout of Hylas, and for the 6-mans, of course, you could bring 2 with the inclusion of every war gear option, but for the 3-man, we're running the standard scanner and searchlight. And I think the role of the 3-man Pioneer squad isn't to actually be aggressive on the board, but is to help complement some of the secondary scoring. So we're probably going to be using this to go up from reserves and pop back down and try to get some secondaries with this. Now, all that said, the list is exceptionally fast. It is very aggressive. You have scout moves, you have 12-inch moves, you are everywhere at once. You could go anywhere on the table, and because of the built-in redundancies you have with the 6 Sagittars or the 2 large bike squads, you could pick up any designated target, especially if they're double judged. I think the list is also really well internally balanced. As I mentioned before, you have these complementary inclusions. As we see with the Sagittars being a dedicated anti-tank platform, and then we have our 2 skirmishing bike squads which are going out to pick up infantry, and of course we have some skirmishers like we see with the Berserks and the Hearthguard. We also can't ignore the fact that it has fantastic secondary play just by proxy of bringing things to fill your Sagittars with. You have a ton of cheap options, things you don't really care about, they're not here to do damage, you send them anywhere you want to go across the table thanks to your Sagittars and their fast movement, and you're able to just reliably get any secondaries, any activations you need to be making, or just throw bodies on objectives to get that OC value up. That said, I do think there are some weaknesses in this list. I couldn't really think of too many, and these are more questions than actual hard weaknesses, but I do feel like the list probably, if it has to struggle, is going to be into this gray area of elite infantry. I think that elite infantry like Custodes or Death Guard are probably a tougher matchup because the Sagittars, their high damage spike, is going to be wasted on this. They have the potential to have a high number of shots, sure, but typically you won't actually get all that many that go through. It's going to be more of quality shots than quantity, and because of that, these elite infantry might be able to just shrug it off or have you waste damage because it doesn't spill over. I also think the bikes might struggle into these elite infantry units because the high quantity of shots simply might not be strong enough to connect, particularly if you don't have judgment tokens on these units. I'm also inclined to wonder how this list might play against a really aggressive army that tries to match its tempo or exceed in it. What happens if you're playing as something like World Eaters or Drukhari, for example? These are hyper-aggressive armies, they're very fast, and they're reliably able to pick up anything on your side of the table very easily. So I think it's going to be a little bit difficult to effectively trade in these kinds of games because the enemy army simply might be a bit faster and punch a little bit harder. I'm not entirely sure if these are weaknesses, they're more so just questions and thoughts I had while looking at the list. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. With the list analysis done, let's take a quick moment and talk matchups. Game 1 into Votann, the mirror matchup. I was pretty interested to see what kind of list the opponent was running, just to better understand the point discrepancy we see here with the results. So this player was running a Brokir Ironmaster, Ioneer Champion, a Cal, Hearthkin Warriors, 6 Sagittars as well, some Berserks, a big brick of Hearthguard, and 2 big squads of 6-man Pioneers each. So honestly, very similar. However, I do think there's one very major difference, and that is that the core list we're analyzing today simply brought more secondary pieces along for the ride. They have an extra squad of bikes, 3-man, they have the inclusion of the 2 Grimnirs, and as a result of this, I think that if you're looking at simply trading activations in terms of damage, it's pretty one-to-one. You have a lot of, in this mirror match, a lot of mirrored units, down to the 6 Sagittars and the 2 big squad of bikes, which is funny. I think this is a European thing because we rarely see this done in NA. But anyway, here we have 2 lists that have done it. And I think, like I was saying, the main difference is that the first list is better able to adapt to secondaries. The second list has a bigger focus on primary. You can see here the extra squad of berserks just to have more skirmishers. And by sacrificing some of those tech pieces, you get to bring in a little bit more damage. We also see the inclusion of the engineer, the Iron Master, who's going to be going around trying to repair the Sagittars. I personally don't think it's worth running the engineer, the Iron Master, even if you're bringing a lot of Sagittars. I feel like at 9 wounds, they do end up dying if they take focused fire. Maybe you'll be able to get a couple wounds saved. It could come in handy. I personally don't think it's points well spent when you could instead be allocating those points to something that might be a little bit better, a little bit more effective at scoring you some secondaries and teching into that. But I understand the rationale when you're investing so many points in vehicles and you have so many of them on the table going towards primary objectives. It helps to just have that little extra bit of a boost in case you need to save a couple of damage here and there between the rounds. Game 2 against Eldari, I put the list here on the screen. It's not too dissimilar from what we've seen in previous competitive list analyses. It looks like overall the Eldari meta as a whole has shifted towards more MSU, so you bring a ton of bodies, but just really cheap infantry. You bring them across the board, you have a ton of activations for damage, for mobility, and most importantly for scoring. Now, post data slate, I predicted that if the meta does take shape for Eldari like this, where we see some smaller squads of infantry making up the bulk of the lists, that Votann will actually do pretty well into that archetype. And I think the reason is that we have so many redundancies in terms of, first of all, our defensive profiles. So if these units do manage to poke through into one of our tanks, into one of our vehicles, and they get through somehow, whatever's inside could then come out, and that's an activation for us that they didn't necessarily get to kill. I also think that we are pretty fast when you consider that you're running 6 Sagittars and a bunch of bikes. I also think we have a ton of small arms fire, meaning that we can pretty reliably pick up any infantry unit we shoot at, especially with the 6-man bikes. It's absolutely insane. These things are probably running rampant across the table, just gunning everything down, trying to get some angles, trying to pick up characters whenever they can as well. So in a lot of ways, we actually match some of the speed that we might see with this Eldari list. And I think we do have the pieces and the units that have been included here to actually have better scoring and killing potential at that. Game 3 into Death Guard. I always love seeing Death Guard lists because of how simple they are. So here we have a bunch of characters, and then we also have the Plague Marines, some Rhinos to put them in, some Bloat Drones, and then a bunch of Plague Burst Crawlers with a Predator Destructor. So I think it's a pretty interesting list. It's very durable. There aren't too many models on the table, but what models we do have are extremely efficient data sheets. They're things that are tough, they're things that have OC, they're things that, relative to Death Guard are decently fast when you consider Rhinos carrying the Plague Marines inside. And I think what's detrimental here is the inclusion of the Plague Burst Crawlers and their Mortar, which is an indirect weapon, and the profile is devastating. I have no doubt that what happened here was that the Death Guard player was able to reliably clean out the big threatening bike squads safely from his backfield objective. He's also able to start picking up any other Votann models once that's dealt with, because now he doesn't necessarily have to worry as much about any of his infantry getting killed by the bikes. And I think this made for a very killy game. Overall, it looks like it was a very low point score game, which is why I'm pretty convinced that they spend most of the time just shooting each other, to which I feel that you ultimately have no choice. You simply can't ignore any of the things inside of this list because they have good OC, they're pretty killy, and they're quite durable as well. And conversely with the Votann player, you can't simply let the bikes roam around the table or let the Sagittars move unpunished. You also have the Fetid Bloat Drones, which probably trade pretty nicely into your Eye on your Hearthguard brick, so when that does come down, the Bloat Drones will be able to quickly come in and try to clean them up. So I do think it's a really killy heavy game, and because of that, both players are just kind of scrambling around the board, trying to survive and score as much as they can. And at the end of it, we get this really low point game. I'd love to hear how the pilot felt this game went, if he has anything to say about the matchup, because it looks like overall it was a really interesting game. Next up, we have Thousand Suns. Now, apparently you could watch this video on stream, and what happened was that the Votann player was hyper aggressive at the start of the game and went straight for the backfield to try to kill as many characters as he can. I think this is probably the smart move, because Thousand Suns are pretty decent at ramping, especially when you get to amplify some of your damage and just benefit from all your Cabal points in order to safely dish out a ton of damage. Thanks to the bikes and your Sagittars, which are exceptionally quick, I think if you get first turn here, you have the opportunity to absolutely destroy your opponent's backfield if you wanted to. And you don't necessarily care about throwing your bikes away in this instance, because this is why they're here. Their purpose is to take care of any infantry threat that might, in turn, threaten you. And so by dealing with the characters, if you have that opportunity, picking up things in their backfield, and just systematically neutering the damage output of the Thousand Suns army, I think that's a good trade. Also worth mentioning, Magnus, he is decently durable because he has the ability to make damage equal to 0, but I think when you're running 6 Sagittars, you're gonna nuke him. You can absolutely pick him up in one round of shooting, and that's probably what happened. I didn't have a chance to watch the game, but I can link it down in the description below if you're interested in checking it out. Okay, Game 5 into Custodes. Now, both Game 5 and Game 6 were into Custodes, and the scores are quite different across both of these matches. And I do think that that can at least partially be attributed to the types of lists both Custodes players were running within the context of this Votann list. Now, one of the key things in the Custodes list that I think helped contribute to such a close game is the heavy inclusion of elite infantry units, namely the Wardens and the Guard. Now, I mentioned when we were talking about some possible weaknesses that I feel like there's this gray area where the list might struggle, and that is into more of the elite infantry lists like we saw with the Death Guards and this Custodes game. I feel like even if you are able to put your judgment tokens when you're running such a heavy Sagittar and bike list, both of these units aren't necessarily ideal in shooting into these targets. It also means that if you want to get close to them and get on the objective to try to contest it, you're going to have to get into melee combat with the Custodes. And if you're running so many elite infantry units as a Custodes player, this is what you want. You are hoping that the Votann player comes into melee with you, gets close, drops his Hearthguard, tries to contest an objective. Even if you just want to touch toes by putting your Sagittar on top of an objective and the Custodes player takes advantage of that, that's a dead Sagittar. So what's very likely to have happened in this game is, I think, due to the inclusion in the design of such an elite infantry list, with very minimal emphasis on prosecutors, for example, we actually wind up with a very killy and durable and resilient Custodes army that is going to be difficult to shift off of objectives. That's how Custodes plays. That's what they want to do. In a lot of ways, they simply want you to come to them while they don't have to necessarily be the aggressors, and when you do come to them, they'll kill you. Ultimately, it was a very close game at 98 to 97, which is basically a draw, so I would love to hear how the player felt this game went, if he thinks there were some things in particular to help contribute towards his victory, or if it really just came down to a lucky dice roll at the end. Now, Game 6, the final game of the event, into Custodes again. And so I put the list up on the screen, and what you'll probably notice immediately is that it is significantly lighter on elite infantry. It's actually quite heavy on tech, as you see with the inclusion of the prosecutors here, which is obviously a really good trade-off if you're looking to maybe have a little bit more activations for secondaries or throwing units away onto objectives for OC count. But I do think in this matchup against this specific Votann list, where you're running so many bikes, you're running so much output against anti-infantry, this is a blessing. You have fewer things to worry about. Yes, there are big bricks of Alaris Custodians, but there's only 2, and they're 325 points each. So this is a core unit. You put your 2 judgment tokens on this, and with your army, you should be able to pick these 2 things up, even if it takes all the shooting you have. But once these are dealt with, you're in a really good place. You don't necessarily have to worry about the prosecutors because your bikes could take care of them if you're worried about your opponent outscoring you in secondaries. And then at this point, once you've dealt with the Alaris Custodians and you've dealt with the prosecutors, your opponent doesn't necessarily have the bodies or the damage left to contest you. And I believe this is what ultimately led to the victory of 82 to 69 here against the Custodes player. Just very good target priority on the side of the pilot, and of course a solid list that's designed to take advantage of situations like this. So again, a huge congratulations to Max Cantor for his 6-win, 0-draw, 0-loss victory at the Firebug Open, taking 2nd place out of 156 players. And a big congratulations to everybody else who attended the event and of course tried their best to get these incredible results. If you enjoy this kind of content, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave me a comment down below, let me know what you think about the list, and feel free to join our community Discord channel to stay up to date and engaged with all things Votann related. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.